In a small coastal town where everyone knew each other's business, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The grocery store was one of those places where people gathered not just to shop, but also to catch up on gossip or exchange stories about their day. On this particular afternoon, the line at the checkout counter stretched longer than usual, filled with familiar faces chatting away. Among them stood a woman no one paid much attention to until now. She was short, her hair streaked with gray, and she wore an old jacket that looked like it had seen better days, many, many better days. The jacket was faded, patched up in several spots, and covered in what seemed like random badges and symbols. Some were military insignias, others resembled flags, and a few looked downright mysterious. To most people waiting in line, it looked like something someone might find at a thrift store clearance rack. The whispers started almost immediately. A group of teenagers standing nearby couldn't help themselves. One of them snickered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "What is she even trying to say with that thing?" he said, pointing discreetly toward the jacket. His friends burst into laughter, clearly entertained by his remark. An older man behind them shook his head disapprovingly, not because he felt bad for the woman, but because he thought her choice of clothing was absurd. "Looks like she raided somebody's attic," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for those around him to chuckle along. Even the cashier raised an eyebrow when the woman placed her items on the belt, silently judging the mismatched patches as if they were some kind of fashion crime, but the woman didn't react. Not once did she turn around to confront the snickers or defend herself. Instead, she kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the task at hand. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her wallet, pulling out crumpled bills to pay for her groceries. Once the transaction was complete, she quickly stuffed the receipt into her pocket, grabbed her bag, and walked out without saying a word. No one noticed the way her shoulders sagged as she pushed open the heavy glass door, nor how she paused for a moment outside to take a deep breath before continuing down the street. To the crowd inside, she was just another odd character in a town full of quirks, a nobody whose strange jacket provided a few minutes of amusement. What they didn't realize, however, was that beneath the surface of that worn-out fabric lay a story so profound it would leave them speechless if they only knew. Unbeknownst to the shoppers mocking her, the jacket wasn't just an eccentric piece of clothing, it was a relic of sorts, carrying pieces of a life far more extraordinary than any of them could imagine. Each patch sewn onto it told a fragment of a tale involving courage, sacrifice, and heartbreak. And while the townsfolk dismissed it as tacky and laughable, the truth was far from amusing. In fact, it was hauntingly beautiful. As the woman disappeared around the corner, the murmurs eventually died down, and the line resumed its usual rhythm. People went back to discussing mundane topics like the weather or complaining about rising prices. None of them gave a second thought to the quiet figure who had briefly interrupted their routine. Little did they know, fate had already set wheels in motion that would soon force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about her and themselves. For now, though, the woman simply continued on her way, clutching the jacket closer to her chest as if drawing strength from it. She had grown used to the stares and the whispers over the years. They no longer stung as sharply as they once did. Still, there was a part of her that longed for understanding, for someone to see beyond the frayed edges and recognize the depth of what she carried, not just on her back, but in her heart. But today, like so many days before, she remained invisible to the world around her. The woman spent most of her days in quiet solitude, finding comfort in the rhythm of small-town life. After leaving the grocery store that afternoon, she made her way to the marina, a place she often visited when she needed to clear her mind. It was peaceful there, with the sound of waves lapping against the docks and the salty breeze brushing past her face. She always brought the jacket with her, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders as if it were a shield against the weight of the world. She settled onto a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water, letting her thoughts drift. The jacket felt heavier today, not because of its material, but because of the sting of the laughter she'd endured earlier. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, even if it was negative attention. Most days she preferred blending into the background, unnoticed and unbothered. But today had been different. Today, the mocking voices lingered in her ears, making her feel exposed in a way she hadn't felt in years. As she sat there, staring out at the horizon, she didn't notice the figure approaching her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded respect without saying a word. Dressed in casual clothes, jeans, and a plain navy blue sweater, he looked like any other visitor passing through town. But there was something about him, a certain sharpness in his gaze, that hinted at a deeper story beneath the surface. He stopped a few feet away, hesitating for a moment before taking another step closer. His eyes were fixed on the jacket she wore, scanning its patches with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. For a second, she thought he might be another person coming to ridicule her, but then he spoke, his voice steady and respectful. "Ma'am," he said, his tone soft, yet firm. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you get that jacket?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her about the jacket before, at least, not in a way that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery. She glanced up at him, studying his face. There was no hint of judgment or amusement in his expression, only a kind of restrained urgency that made her wonder what he knew. It belonged to my husband," she replied cautiously, clutching the edges of the jacket instinctively. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried enough emotion to make him nod slowly, as though he understood more than she realized. He took a seat beside her on the bench, keeping a respectful distance. "May I ask which unit he served in?" he continued, his words careful and deliberate. Her brow furrowed slightly at the specificity of his question. "How do you know he was in the military?" she asked, her tone guarded now. This man clearly wasn't just a random passerby. He exhaled deeply, leaning back slightly as if gathering his thoughts. "Because of this patch here," he said, pointing to a small emblem near the collar of her jacket, a black trident surrounded by stars. To anyone else, it might have looked like just another decorative piece, but to him, it meant something far greater. That's not something you see every day. Only people who've served in a very specific group would recognize it. The woman's grip on the jacket tightened, and for a moment she considered standing up and walking away. Something about the way he spoke, the authority in his voice, the familiarity in his eyes made her uneasy. Yet, at the same time, there was a part of her that wanted to trust him. Maybe it was the sincerity in his demeanor or the fact that he seemed to understand the significance of what she carried. He was part of a special operations team, she admitted finally, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't talk about it much. It's complicated." The man nodded again, his expression softening. "I can imagine," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he added, "My name is Captain Hayes. I used to lead a unit similar to the one your husband served in." The revelation hit her like a wave, and she turned to look at him fully for the first time. Now that she studied him more closely, she could see it, the posture, the discipline, the faint lines of exhaustion etched into his face. This wasn't just any retired soldier. This was someone who had walked the same path as her husband. Someone who might truly understand. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward but rather heavy with unspoken memories and shared understanding. Finally, Hayes broke it. "If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear more about him. About his service. If nothing else, it would mean a lot to me personally." His request surprised her. She had Spent so many years guarding her husband's memory, keeping it tucked away like a fragile treasure too precious to share. But something about Hayes, his quiet determination, his obvious connection to the world her husband had inhabited, made her reconsider. "All right," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the patches on the jacket. "But let's go somewhere quieter. This isn't the kind of story you tell in public." They ended up at a small cafe a block away from the marina. It was cozy, with warm lighting and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They chose a corner table, away from prying eyes, and ordered 2 cups of tea. As they waited for their drinks, the woman began to speak, her words slow and measured at first, but gradually gaining momentum as she recounted the details of her husband's life. He joined the military straight out of high school, she explained, her gaze distant as if watching old memories play out before her. He always had this sense of duty, this need to protect others. At first, I didn't understand it. I thought it was reckless, maybe even selfish. But over time, I realized it wasn't about glory or adventure for him. It was about doing what he believed was right. Hayes listened intently, his hands wrapped around his teacup, absorbing every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't push for more information. He simply let her talk, giving her the space to open up at her own pace. He was good at what he did, she continued, a hint of pride creeping into her voice despite the sadness lingering beneath. Really good. His teammates respected him, trusted him. And he loved them like brothers. That's why. Her voice faltered and she paused to take a shaky breath. That's why losing him hurt so much. Not just for me, but for everyone who knew him. Hayes reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over hers. "You don't have to say anything else if it's too painful," he said softly. "I already know how hard it must have been for you." She shook her head, blinking back tears. "No, it's okay. You deserve to know. He gave everything for his country, for his team, and I want people to remember that. Not just the jokes or the whispers, but the truth behind the jacket." By the time they left the cafe, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the town. The woman felt lighter somehow, as though sharing her story had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Hayes walked her back to the marina, promising to stay in touch. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said as they parted ways. "And I promise you I won't let his sacrifice be forgotten." As she watched him disappear into the evening crowd, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a grieving widow clinging to the past, but as someone whose love and loss mattered. And deep down, she knew that this chance encounter was only the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, Captain Hayes couldn't shake off the weight of the conversation from the previous evening. The woman's story had stirred something deep within him, memories he had tried to bury, emotions he thought he had left behind after retiring from service. Sitting alone in his small rented room by the marina, he stared at the ceiling, replaying her words in his mind. Her husband's sacrifice wasn't just a distant tale. It was personal. It hit too close to home. He knew exactly who she was talking about. Though she hadn't mentioned his name, the description, the trident patch, the unit, the reputation for bravery, it all pointed to one man, a soldier whose loss still haunted Hayes and his former teammates. They had served together on missions that pushed the limits of human endurance, missions where trust meant life or death. And when that trust was betrayed not by their own team, but by circumstances beyond their control, it left scars that never fully healed. Hayes decided he needed to act. He couldn't let the ridicule and mockery continue, not when the truth was so profound. He owed it to the memory of the man she loved, and to the woman who carried that love like a torch through the darkest nights. Confronting the grocery store, his first stop was the grocery store. It was early, and the place was quieter than usual, with only a few shoppers milling about. Hayes approached the manager, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a clipboard perpetually tucked under his arm. The manager looked up, surprised to see someone in civilian clothes addressing him with such authority. "I need to talk to you about something important," Hayes said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's about one of your customers." The manager raised an eyebrow but gestured for Hayes to follow him into a small office tucked behind the storage area. Once inside, Hayes got straight to the point. "There's a woman who comes here regularly. She wears an old jacket covered in patches. You might have noticed her people have been making fun of her." The manager frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I can't control what people say outside of work hours. This isn't about gossip." Hayes interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "That jacket belongs to a hero, a real one. Those patches aren't random, they represent acts of courage most people will never understand. The woman wearing it, her husband gave his life saving others. Men like me are alive today because of him." The manager's face paled. I didn't know," he stammered. "I mean, I saw her yesterday, and yeah, some folks were laughing. But I didn't think—" "You didn't ask," Hayes finished for him. "But now you know, and I'm asking you to do something about it." The manager nodded slowly, guilt washing over his features. "What do you want me to do?" "Spread the word," Hayes replied. "Tell your staff, tell the regulars. Make sure everyone understands who they're mocking. Because if I hear another whisper about that jacket, I'll make sure the whole town knows why it deserves respect." Word travels fast. By mid-morning, the story was already spreading like wildfire. The manager had pulled aside a few employees during their shift changes, explaining what Hayes had told him. One of the cashiers, a young woman who had snickered along with the teenagers the day before, felt a pang of shame as she listened. She immediately texted her friends, urging them to stop joking about the crazy lady with the ugly jacket. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in the grocery store knew the truth, or at least enough of it to realize they'd been horribly wrong. Outside the store, the buzz grew louder. In a small town like this, news traveled fast. Neighbors whispered to each other over fences. Shopkeepers shared the story with customers, and even the local diner became a hub of discussion. Some felt defensive, insisting they hadn't meant any harm. Others admitted they judged too quickly without knowing the full picture. But regardless of how they reacted, one thing was clear: the woman with the jacket was no longer invisible. A town meeting that evening, a group of residents gathered at the community center. It wasn't an official meeting, just a handful of concerned citizens who wanted to discuss what had happened. Hayes attended, standing near the back of the room with his arms crossed. He wasn't there to take charge, he simply wanted to ensure the message stayed true. One of the organizers, a retired teacher named Mrs. Peterson, stood up to address the crowd. "We've all heard the rumors by now," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "About the woman in the jacket. About her husband. About what he did for his country. What we haven't talked about yet is what we did." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We laughed. We judged. We dismissed her as some eccentric nobody instead of taking the time to understand. Well, I don't know about you, but I feel ashamed. That jacket isn't just fabric, it's a symbol of sacrifice, of love, of everything we claim to value as a community." Her speech struck a chord. Heads bowed in silence as people reflected on their actions or lack thereof. Someone suggested organizing a proper tribute to honor the memory of the woman's husband. Another proposed inviting her to speak at the next town hall meeting. Ideas flowed freely, fueled by a collective desire to make amends. Hayes stepped forward then, drawing everyone's attention. "This isn't about guilt," he said firmly. "It's about growth. about learning to see people for who they really are instead of jumping to conclusions based on appearances. This woman has carried her husband's legacy for years, quietly, and without complaint. All she wants is respect for him, for herself, and for what they both lost. An invitation extended later that night, Hayes knocked on the door of the woman's modest home. When she opened it, surprise flickered across her face. "Captain Hayes," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure how to phrase what he was about to say. "I spoke to some people today," he began, "at the grocery store, and then at the community center. I told them about your husband, about what he did, about what you've done to keep his memory alive." Her eyes widened slightly, and she clasped her hands together nervously. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Hayes replied gently. "But they needed to hear it. They needed to understand. And now they want to show their support. There's going to be a gathering tomorrow evening, nothing big, just a chance for people to apologize and thank you properly." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't need apologies," she whispered. "All I ever wanted was for people to see him, to see us for who we really are. And now they do," Hayes said firmly. "You don't have to go if you don't want to. But I think it could mean a lot not just to them, but to you too." After a long pause, she finally nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll come." A new perspective. As Hayes walked back to his room that night, he felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. For so long, he had carried the burden of his friend's death, feeling powerless to change anything. But tonight, he had taken a step toward healing, not just for himself, but for the woman and the entire town. Tomorrow would be a turning point. The townsfolk would finally meet the person behind the jacket, not as a subject of ridicule, but as a symbol of resilience and strength. And maybe, just maybe, they would learn to look beyond the surface, not just at jackets, but at each other. The evening of the gathering arrived, and the community center buzzed with an energy that was both nervous and hopeful. People from all corners of the town had shown up, some out of curiosity, others out of guilt, and a few because they genuinely wanted to make amends. The room was decorated simply, with strings of white lights strung along the walls and a table set up at the front for speeches. It wasn't flashy or extravagant. It didn't need to be. This wasn't about putting on a show. It was about acknowledging a truth that had been overlooked for far too long. Captain Hayes stood near the entrance, greeting people as they filed in. He could see the mix of emotions on their faces. Some looked sheepish, others determined, and a handful seemed unsure of why they were even there. But one thing was clear: they had come, and that mattered. When the woman finally walked in, wearing her jacket as always, the room fell silent. She hesitated for a moment in the doorway, scanning the crowd with wide eyes. For years she had been invisible to these people, dismissed as nothing more than a quirky figure in a worn-out coat. Now every pair of eyes was fixed on her, not with mockery but with something closer to reverence. Hayes stepped forward, offering her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," he whispered as he guided her to the front of the room. "Just being here is enough." She nodded slowly, though her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edges of her jacket. The weight of everyone's gaze felt overwhelming, but there was also a flicker of relief, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment she'd waited for without even realizing it. A moment of truth. Mrs. Peterson, the retired teacher who had organized the event, took the stage first. She adjusted the microphone, her hands steady despite the gravity of the occasion. Clearing her throat, she began to speak, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "Most of us are here tonight because we got something terribly wrong," she said, her tone measured but filled with emotion. We judge someone based on appearances instead of taking the time to understand. We laughed when we should have listened, and we dismissed when we should have honored. Her words hung heavy in the air, prompting nods and murmurs of agreement from the audience. She paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. But tonight, we're trying to fix that. Tonight, we're saying thank you, not just to the woman standing before us, but to the man whose memory she carries. A man who gave everything so others might live. As Mrs. Peterson spoke, the woman felt tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't expected such heartfelt words, hadn't anticipated that these same people who had once mocked her would now stand united in honoring her husband's legacy. It was surreal, almost like stepping into a dream where justice finally prevailed, sharing. The story after Mrs. Peterson finished, Captain Hayes took the stage. His presence commanded attention, and the room grew even quieter as he began to speak. I served alongside men and women who embodied courage in its purest form, he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Men and women who didn't hesitate to put themselves in harm's way for the greater good. One of those men was her husband. He gestured toward the woman who sat stiffly in her chair, gripping the arms tightly. What he did during that final mission. It's the kind of thing movies are made about. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real life. He stayed behind, knowing full well what it meant, so the rest of us could escape. Every single person in my unit owes their life to him, including me. His voice cracked slightly as he added. And yet, until yesterday, I didn't know his wife still carried his story with her every day. That jacket? It's not just fabric. It's history. Each patch tells a piece of his journey, the battles he fought, the places he went, the bonds he formed. When you laugh at that jacket, you're laughing at all of that. At him. The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and regret. Some people wiped away tears while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hayes let the weight of his words settle before concluding. So tonight, I ask you to look again. Look closer. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden beneath the surface. Apologies and healing one by one, people approached the woman after Hayes stepped down. An older man who had once rolled his eyes at her jacket now held out his hand, his face etched with remorse. "I'm sorry," he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know. I should have known." A teenage boy, part of the group that had snickered at the grocery store, shuffled forward awkwardly. "We were jerks," he admitted, looking down at his shoes. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I swear." The woman listened quietly, nodding occasionally as each apology poured forth. She didn't offer forgiveness outright. How could she, when wounds ran so deep? But she accepted their words graciously, her expression softening with each passing moment. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a grieving widow clinging to the past, but as someone worthy of respect and understanding. Even the manager of the grocery store came forward, clutching a bouquet of flowers. "On behalf of everyone at the store, I want to say how sorry we are," he said earnestly. "We'll make sure no one ever mocks you again. Your husband's sacrifice deserves nothing less than our gratitude." By the end of the evening, the atmosphere in the room had transformed entirely. What had started as a somber acknowledgement of wrongdoing had evolved into a celebration of resilience and redemption. People lingered afterward, chatting animatedly and sharing stories of their own loved ones who had served. Strangers became acquaintances, united by a newfound appreciation for the sacrifices made by those who wore uniforms and the families left behind, a tribute to remember. Before closing the event, Mrs. Peterson announced plans for a permanent tribute to honor the woman's husband. "We're commissioning a plaque to be placed near the marina," she explained. "It will feature the trident emblem from his jacket, along with a dedication to his bravery. Every year, on the anniversary of his passing, we'll gather there to remember him and to remind ourselves never to judge a book by its cover." Announcement drew applause, and the woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. For so long, she had carried her husband's memory alone, afraid that the world would forget him. Now, thanks to the efforts of strangers-turned-allies, his legacy would endure not just in her heart, but in the hearts of an entire community. As the night drew to a close, Captain Hayes found himself standing beside her once more. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. She exhaled deeply, a mixture of exhaustion and relief washing over her. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted. "Like I'm not fighting alone anymore." "You're not," Hayes replied firmly, "and you never will be. Not as long as people remember what he did and who he was." With that, they shared a quiet moment of solidarity, two souls bound together by loss, respect, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest times, humanity has the power to heal itself. The days that followed the gathering at the community center brought a noticeable change in the town. People who had once dismissed the woman with the jacket now greeted her warmly whenever they saw her on the street. Shopkeepers tipped their hats, children waved shyly, and even those who had been part of the earlier mockery went out of their way to apologize again. The jacket, once a source of ridicule, had become a symbol of respect, a reminder of the sacrifices made by individuals whose stories often go untold. For the woman, life didn't suddenly become easy or painless. Grief doesn't vanish overnight, no matter how much support surrounds you. But there was a lightness in her step now, a sense of relief that came from finally being understood. She no longer felt invisible. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, knowing that her husband's memory was honored not just by her, but by an entire community. The plaque unveiling a few weeks later, the town gathered near the marina for the unveiling of the plaque dedicated to her husband. It was a crisp morning, with the sun casting golden rays over the water and seagulls circling lazily overhead. The location had been chosen deliberately. It was where she had spent countless hours reflecting, finding solace in the rhythm of the waves. Now it would serve as a permanent tribute to the man who had given everything. The plaque itself was simple yet striking, a black trident surrounded by stars, etched into polished stone. Beneath it were words carefully chosen to capture his essence: "In honor of a brave soul who sacrificed all for others. Your courage will never be forgotten." As the crowd assembled, the woman stood at the front, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. She had picked herself. Captain Hayes stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. He had stayed in touch since their first meeting, forming a bond rooted in mutual respect and shared loss. Though he hadn't planned to stay in town long, something about this place and this woman had drawn him in. When the ceremony began, Mrs. Peterson stepped forward to speak. Her voice carried across the quiet crowd, filled with emotion but unwavering. "Today, we're here to remember not just one person but what he represented," she said. "Courage, sacrifice, love, these are values we hold dear. Yet sometimes we forget to recognize them when they're right in front of us. This plaque is our promise to honor the past, to learn from our mistakes, and to ensure that no act of bravery ever goes unnoticed." Her words resonated deeply, prompting nods and murmurs of agreement from the audience. Then, with a solemn nod, she invited the woman to unveil the plaque. The woman hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the cloth draped over the stone. For years, she had kept her husband's legacy alive in private, sharing it only with the patches on her jacket. Now she was making it public, allowing others to carry the weight of his story alongside her. With a deep breath, she pulled fabric away, revealing the plaque beneath. Tears streamed down her face as applause erupted around her. It wasn't loud or boisterous, just a heartfelt acknowledgement of the man she loved and the life he had saved. As people approached to pay their respects, many placed small tokens at the base of the plaque: flowers, notes, even miniature flags. Each item was a gesture of gratitude, a way of saying, "We see you. We remember." A new connection after the ceremony, the woman found herself sitting alone on a bench overlooking the water. The day had been overwhelming, filled with emotions she hadn't anticipated. Gratitude, yes, but also a bittersweet ache that came with letting go of years of isolation. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and while it felt good to be seen, it also left her feeling vulnerable. Captain Hayes joined her after a while, carrying 2 cups of coffee from a nearby cafe. He handed her one, taking a seat beside her without saying a word. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the boats drift lazily across the horizon. Finally, he broke the quiet. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly, sipping her coffee. "It's strange," she admitted. "For so long, I felt like I was fighting this battle alone. Like no one cared about him or me because we weren't flashy or glamorous. But today reminded me that people do care. They just needed to know why." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen," he said. "And sometimes it takes someone brave enough to share." She glanced at him, her eyes softening. "You played a big part in this, you know. If you hadn't spoken up, none of this would have happened." He shrugged modestly, though a hint of pride flickered in his expression. "I just told the truth. The rest was up to everyone else." They lapsed into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a connection between them now unforged through shared grief and a desire to keep memories alive. Over time, their friendship deepened, becoming a source of strength for both of them. Hayes helped her navigate the challenges of opening up to a community that had wronged her, while she reminded him of the importance of vulnerability and healing. Legacy lives on. In the months that followed, the plaque became a focal point for the town. On sunny afternoons, families stopped by to read its inscription, teaching their children about the sacrifices made by soldiers. On rainy days, visitors left umbrellas propped against it as if shielding it from the elements. And every year, on the anniversary of her husband's passing, the entire town gathered to honor his memory with speeches, songs, and moments of silence. The woman continued wearing her jacket, though the mocking voices were long gone. Strangers often stopped her to thank her for sharing her story, telling her how it had inspired them to look beyond appearances and appreciate the hidden depths in others. To some, she became a symbol of resilience. To others, a gentle reminder of the power of forgiveness. For Captain Hayes, staying in the town turned out to be exactly what he needed. Retiring from service had left him adrift, searching for purpose. In a world that felt foreign after years of combat, helping the woman reconnect with her community gave him a renewed sense of mission, one rooted not in war but in humanity. Together, they proved that even in the face of unimaginable loss, connections can heal wounds and restore faith. The jacket, once mocked, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the fact that true valor isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's found in the smallest acts of remembrance and love. Closing reflections years later, when tourists visited the marina, they couldn't help but notice the plaque nestled among the rocks. Some snapped photos, intrigued by the story behind it. Others lingered, reading the inscription and reflecting on its message. Few realized that the woman who had sparked such a transformation still lived quietly in the town, tending to her garden, and occasionally visiting the plaque to leave fresh flowers. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been meaningful. Through her courage and the kindness of strangers turned friends, she had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The laughter and judgment that had once defined her existence had given way to understanding and unity, a legacy far greater than anyone could have imagined. And as the sun set over the marina, casting a warm glow over the plaque and the water beyond, it was clear that her husband's sacrifice and her unwavering devotion would continue to inspire generations to come.